In the heart of Nashville, amid the glow of Christmas lights and the chill of falling snow, a long-standing tradition lay shattered. McLean's toys, once a symbol of joy and craftsmanship, had become a source of resentment and despair. At the center of it all stood Bianca McLean, a wealthy heiress who traded handmade toys for automated efficiency, leaving the artisans, and the soul of the factory, behind. But when protests erupt, accusing her of destroying the spirit of Christmas, Bianca discovers an old diary left by her grandfather, the factory's founder. Its pages reveal a forgotten truth, that the real magic of McLean's toys was never in the machines, but in the hands and hearts of the people who crafted each piece. With her reputation in ruins and the community against her, Bianca faces an impossible choice: continue down the cold path of profit or risk everything to reignite the spirit of Christmas by bringing the artisans back. Will she find redemption in time to restore the magic? Or will the legacy of McLean's toys fade into memory, taking the town's holiday spirit with it? The soft hum of machinery was drowned out by the clamor outside the factory gates. Protesters had gathered in growing numbers, their voices echoing against the tall walls of McLean's toys. Signs with bold, angry letters waved in the cold winter air, some reading "Greed over tradition," others accusing the factory of abandoning Nashville's heritage. The faint scent of spray paint lingered, a sign of the fresh graffiti marring the once pristine brick walls. Bianca McLean stood by the large window of her office, her gaze fixed on the scene below. From the warmth of her space, she could see the stark contrast between her world and theirs. People were shivering in the December chill, bundled in coats and scarves, yet their determination was unwavering. They shouted in unison, their words blending into a chant that stung her ears and pricked her conscience. The McLean family name had long been a symbol of pride in Nashville. Decades ago, her grandfather had built the factory not only as a business but as a cornerstone of the community. For years, the factory had produced handcrafted toys that delighted children and adults alike. Each piece bore the mark of its artisan, imbued with care and a touch of magic. But those days were gone. The transition to automation had been Bianca's decision. It was a move she had rationalized as necessary to keep up with modern demands and increase efficiency. The handcrafted toys, she argued, were too costly and time-consuming to produce at scale. Machines, precise and tireless, had replaced the artisans who once poured their hearts into every toy. She had convinced herself it was the right choice. Yet, the scene outside told another story. Bianca turned away from the window, her reflection briefly catching her eye in the glass. The face looking back at her seemed older, wearier than she remembered. She sank into the leather chair behind her desk, the muffled sounds of the protesters still audible. A framed photograph on her desk drew her attention, her grandfather, beaming with pride, standing beside a group of workers in the factory's early days. They looked happy, united. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant, Ellen, stepped in, her expression as tense as the atmosphere outside. "They're not leaving," Ellen said quietly, closing the door behind her. "The press is here too. They've been interviewing some of the former workers." Bianca sighed, rubbing her temples. "And what are they saying?" "They're angry, Bianca. They feel betrayed. One of them said he worked here for over 30 years, only to be replaced by a machine." Ellen hesitated. "The story is already spreading online. People are sharing it, calling for boycotts." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Bianca knew the factory's reputation had taken a hit, but this felt different. This was personal. The McLean name, once synonymous with joy and tradition, was now a lightning rod for criticism. She stood, pacing the room as Ellen watched silently. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Bianca muttered. "I was trying to save the business, not destroy it." Outside, the chants grew louder, as if mocking her words. "Greed isn't magic. Bring back the artisans," someone shouted, their voice rising above the din. Bianca stopped pacing and looked back at the photograph on her desk. The faces of those workers seemed to stare back at her, a silent reminder of what had been lost. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. Have security keep an eye on things, Bianca finally said to Ellen. But don't escalate. I'll figure something out. Ellen nodded, though her expression suggested doubt. Let me know if you need anything. She left the room, leaving Bianca alone with her thoughts. As the hours passed, the protesters began to disperse, their voices fading into the cold night air. But the damage was already done. Bianca stayed in her office, staring out at the empty streets illuminated by the faint glow of Christmas lights. The festive decorations felt like an insult to the tension that had filled the day. She leaned against the window, her breath fogging the glass. In the silence of the evening, she replayed the events in her mind. The graffiti on the walls, the angry faces, the stories of displaced workers, all of it gnawed at her. Deep down, she knew this wasn't just about the factory. It was about something bigger. The McLean legacy was more than just toys. It was about community, about people. Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten that. And now, she was paying the price. Bianca straightened, a flicker of resolve sparking within her. Tomorrow, she would go back to the beginning. She didn't know exactly how, but she would find a way to make things right. For the factory, for the workers, and for the name her grandfather had worked so hard to build. As she turned off the lights and left the office, the words of the protesters lingered in her mind. They weren't just noise, they were a call to action. And for the first time in years, Bianca felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps she could answer it. Bianca's footsteps echoed softly as she climbed the narrow staircase to the attic of her family home. The old wooden steps creaked under her weight, a sound that seemed to amplify the stillness of the house. The air grew colder as she ascended, carrying with it the faint, musty scent of dust and aged wood. The attic door groaned on its hinges as she pushed it open, revealing the dimly lit space beyond. Stacks of old boxes lined the walls, their faded labels hinting at the treasures they contained: Christmas decorations, summer 1985, Dad's tools. Cobwebs stretched like fragile veils across forgotten corners, and the faint light of a single bulb cast long shadows over the room. Bianca stepped carefully, brushing away a stray cobweb that caught on her sleeve. She wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for. The day's events had left her restless, and something about being back in her childhood home pulled her to this neglected part of the house. Her gaze wandered over the stacks of boxes, searching for a clue, a sign, anything to anchor her thoughts. Near the back of the attic, a sturdy old trunk caught her eye. Its leather straps were worn and cracked, and the brass lock was tarnished with age. She recognized it immediately. It had belonged to her grandfather. Kneeling in front of it, Bianca ran her fingers over the surface, tracing the initials, JM, etched into the wood. The lock yielded easily to her touch, and the lid creaked as she opened it. Inside, the trunk was filled with relics of a bygone era: yellowed papers, faded photographs, and small wooden toys that bore the marks of careful craftsmanship. She picked up a carved horse, its paint chipped but its form still sturdy. It fit perfectly in her hand, as though waiting for her to rediscover it. Beneath the toys and papers lay a leather-bound book. Its cover was worn smooth, the edges frayed from years of handling. Bianca's breath caught as she opened it and realized it was her grandfather's journal. The pages were filled with his neat, meticulous handwriting, the ink slightly faded but still legible. She sat back on her heels, her heart pounding as she read the first entry: December 10, 1960. Today, we finished our first batch of wooden toys. There's something magical about seeing them take shape, knowing they'll bring joy to children. Every toy carries a piece of us, a story, a memory, a bit of love. Bianca turned the pages slowly, each entry pulling her deeper into her grandfather's world. He wrote about the early days of the factory, the long hours spent perfecting designs, and the pride he felt in his team of artisans. There were sketches of toy ideas in the margins, some of which she recognized from her childhood. One entry, dated December 20, 1975, caught her eye. The holidays are the busiest time of year, but it's also when the factory feels most alive. The laughter, the camaraderie, the joy of creating something meaningful, it's a reminder of why we do this. Toys aren't just objects. They're vessels for dreams and memories. They connect people, spark imagination, and remind us of simpler times. Bianca felt a lump form in her throat. She remembered those holidays, the way the factory seemed to transform into a wonderland of activity and cheer. As a child, she had loved visiting the workshop, watching the artisans at their craft, and helping where she could. She had painted her first doll there, her small hands carefully applying bright red paint to its wooden lips. Her grandfather had been her hero, a man who seemed larger than life. He had a way of making everyone feel valued, from the oldest artisan to the youngest apprentice. He believed in the power of connection, the idea that the smallest gestures could leave lasting impacts. Bianca closed the journal briefly, holding it against her chest as memories washed over her. She had been so focused on running the factory efficiently, on keeping up with modern trends and market demands, that she had lost sight of those values. The automation, the layoffs, they had seemed like logical decisions at the time, but now they felt like betrayals of everything her grandfather had stood for. Setting the journal aside, she reached back into the trunk and pulled out a bundle of photographs tied with twine. The images were black and white, some slightly blurred, but their subjects were clear. They showed her grandfather with his workers, their faces lit with genuine smiles. One photo, in particular, stood out. It was a group shot taken in the factory during Christmas, with rows of toys lined up behind them. Her grandfather stood in the center, his arm around a young artisan, both of them holding a beautifully crafted wooden train. Bianca couldn't help but smile at the image, though it was tinged with sadness. The faces in the photo were likely the same people protesting outside the factory today. They had given their lives to McLean's toys, trusting that it would always be a place of security and pride. And she had let them down. The journal and photographs were joined by letters and scraps of paper with notes and ideas. One note, written in bold capital letters, read, "Never forget, the magic is in the people." The words felt like a rebuke and a call to action. Bianca sat there for what felt like hours, absorbing the contents of the trunk, reconnecting with a past she had all but abandoned. Her grandfather's words were a reminder of what the factory had once been and what it could be again. By the time she closed the trunk and stood, the attic felt different, warmer, somehow, as if her grandfather's presence lingered there. Bianca carried the journal with her as she descended the stairs, her steps no longer hesitant. That night, she sat by the fire, the journal open on her lap. The words she had read replayed in her mind, blending with her own memories and the voices of the protesters outside the factory. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't continue down the path she had chosen. Something had to change. And perhaps, buried in her grandfather's words and the lessons of the past, she could find a way forward. As the firelight flickered and cast shadows across the room, Bianca felt a small spark of hope ignite within her. The journey ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt she was heading in the right direction. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of the McLean family home, illuminating the intricate details of its decor. Yet, the warm light did little to ease the heaviness in Bianca's chest. She sat at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee untouched in front of her. The journal her grandfather had written lay open, its words still fresh in her mind from the night before. She flipped through its pages absently, stopping every so often to reread a line or study one of his sketches. Her grandfather's words about the importance of people, community, and tradition resonated deeply, filling her with a mix of nostalgia and guilt. She closed the journal, resting her hand on its worn leather cover as though trying to draw strength from it. Bianca had always prided herself on being practical and forward-thinking. When she took over the factory, she had seen its challenges as puzzles to be solved. She thought in terms of efficiency, scalability, and profits. Yet, somewhere in the quiet hours of the morning, she began to question the foundation of those choices. Her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her from her thoughts. It was Ellen, her assistant, checking in after yesterday's protests. The message was short but carried weight: "The story is spreading. The factory's reputation is in trouble." Bianca sighed, typing a quick response to acknowledge the update. She felt the mounting pressure, but what stung more was the realization that the protesters' words were not entirely wrong. Pushing her chair back, she walked to the window overlooking the backyard. Beyond the frost-covered lawn was a small wooden shed where her grandfather used to work on prototypes. The sight of it brought back a flood of memories, the smell of sawdust and varnish, the sound of tools clinking, and the feeling of pride when her grandfather showed her his latest creation. Bianca hadn't stepped inside that shed in years, but something drew her to it now. She grabbed her coat and ventured outside, the crisp December air biting at her cheeks. The shed door was stiff, but it gave way with a groan, revealing the familiar interior. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through a small window. Shelves lined with jars of nails, screws, and paint cans stood undisturbed, while an old workbench remained cluttered with tools, as though waiting for their owner to return. She ran her hand along the surface of the workbench, her fingers tracing the worn grooves and scratches. A half-carved wooden figure sat abandoned in the corner, its features barely discernible but undeniably familiar. Bianca picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It was the beginnings of a toy soldier, its rough edges speaking of a work in progress. The figure stirred a memory of her childhood, her grandfather showing her how to carve, his hands guiding hers as they shaped the wood. He had always insisted that the process was just as important as the result. The love you put into making something is what gives it value, he had said. That love seemed to be missing now. The automated machines in the factory were precise, efficient, and consistent, but they lacked the heart and soul that the artisans had once infused into their work. Bianca wondered if her grandfather would have approved of the path she had taken. Deep down, she already knew the answer. She placed the wooden figure back on the workbench and turned to leave. Her mind was restless, a whirlpool of thoughts and emotions. On her way back to the house, she passed by the old oak tree where she and her childhood friend Grace used to play. They had spent countless afternoons here, their laughter echoing through the yard as they imagined fantastical adventures with the very toys made in the factory. Grace. The thought of her name sparked a new pang of guilt. She had been one of the first to voice concern when Bianca announced the shift to automation. Grace's family had worked for the factory for generations, and her father had been one of the artisans who lost his job. They hadn't spoken in years, their friendship fractured by the decisions Bianca had made. Inside the house, Bianca stood by the fireplace, staring into the flickering flames. She thought about reaching out to Grace, but the idea felt daunting. How could she bridge the gap after all this time? She needed guidance, but her grandfather's journal could only take her so far. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of the doorbell. She opened the door to find an unexpected visitor, Robert, one of the few remaining workers at the factory who had been with the company since her grandfather's time. His weathered face was etched with worry, but his eyes held a flicker of the same determination she remembered from her childhood. "I hope I'm not intruding," Robert said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Not at all," Bianca replied, stepping aside to let him in. They sat in the living room, the journal still resting on the coffee table. Robert's gaze lingered on it for a moment before he spoke. "I thought I'd stop by to see how you're holding up after yesterday," he began. "The protests have stirred up a lot of emotions, and I imagine it hasn't been easy for you." Bianca nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It hasn't. But it's not just the protests, Robert. It's everything. I can't stop thinking about what I've done to the factory, to the people who built it alongside my grandfather. I thought I was making the right choices, but now, I'm not so sure." Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Your grandfather was a man who believed in people, Bianca. He always said the heart of the factory wasn't in the machines or the profits, it was in the hands that crafted the toys and the community that supported it." His words struck a chord, echoing the sentiments Bianca had read in the journal. "I've been reading his writings," she admitted, gesturing to the book. "It's like he's reminding me of everything I've forgotten." Robert offered a small, encouraging smile. "Then maybe it's time to start listening." They talked for hours, reminiscing about the old days and the values that had once defined McLean's toys. Robert shared stories of the artisans, their dedication, and the pride they took in their work. Each story deepened Bianca's understanding of the impact her decisions had made, not just on the factory, but on the lives of those who had been part of its legacy. By the time Robert left, the sky had darkened, and the first flakes of snow began to fall. Bianca stood by the window, watching the snow coat the ground in a pristine white blanket. She felt a glimmer of clarity, a sense that the path forward would require more than just acknowledgement of her mistakes, it would demand action. The fire crackled softly in the background as she returned to the journal, her grandfather's words now a guiding light in the uncertainty. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would begin the hard work of rebuilding not just the factory's reputation, but the trust and connection it had once fostered. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that it wasn't too late to rediscover the magic her grandfather had cherished so deeply. The next morning, Bianca stood before the large gates of McLean's Toys, her breath visible in the cold air. The protests had stopped for now, leaving the factory eerily quiet. The graffiti scrawled across the walls seemed to stare back at her, its angry words a constant reminder of the community's betrayal. She tightened her grip on the journal tucked under her arm, drawing strength from the words within as she stepped through the gates. Inside, the factory was as she had left it, silent, sterile, and efficient. The hum of the automated machines filled the cavernous space, but the sound felt hollow, devoid of life. Bianca glanced around, her mind wandering to memories of when this place had been alive with the chatter of artisans, the smell of fresh wood, and the occasional burst of laughter. She had been so focused on modernization that she hadn't noticed when the heart of the factory had disappeared. She made her way to the conference room, where Ellen was waiting, a stack of papers in front of her. Ellen looked up and gave a small, uncertain smile. "Good morning," Ellen said, her tone cautious. "Did you have a chance to think about what we discussed yesterday?" "I did," Bianca replied, setting the journal on the table. "And I've made a decision." Ellen raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but hesitant. "What kind of decision?" Bianca took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm going to reach out to the artisans we let go. I want to invite them back to work on a special project, a line of handmade toys for Christmas. It'll be a donation to the children in our community." Ellen blinked, her expression shifting from surprise to skepticism. "You're serious? After everything that's happened?" "Yes," Bianca said firmly. "I know it won't be easy, and I don't expect them to trust me right away. But this is the only way to begin making things right. We need to bring back what made this factory special, and that starts with them." Ellen leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "I admire the sentiment, but you know this won't fix everything, right? The community is angry, and the artisans feel betrayed. A gesture like this might not be enough." "I know," Bianca admitted. "But it's a start. I can't change what I've done, but I can take responsibility and show them that I'm willing to do better." Ellen studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right. I'll help you set it up. But you'll have to be the one to face them." Bianca nodded, feeling a mixture of determination and anxiety. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Later that day, a small team of factory staff helped her draft personal invitations to the artisans who had been laid off. The letters were handwritten, a deliberate choice to show sincerity, and explained the project in detail. Bianca also included a promise: any artisan who participated in the project would be compensated fairly for their time, regardless of the outcome. The next challenge was delivering the invitations in person. It wasn't enough to send them through the mail. Bianca knew she needed to look these people in the eye and acknowledge the pain she had caused. The first stop was a small house on the outskirts of town, where Mr. Caldwell, one of the oldest artisans, lived. Bianca parked her car and hesitated for a moment before stepping out. The house was modest, with a well-kept garden now dormant under a layer of frost. She approached the door and knocked, her heart pounding. The door opened to reveal Mr. Caldwell, his face lined with years of hard work and worry. He looked at her with a mix of surprise and wariness. "Bianca McLean," he said, his tone neutral. "What brings you here?" "I came to talk," she said, her voice steady but soft. "And to give you this." She handed him the envelope. He took it but didn't open it, his eyes fixed on her. Talk about what? The years I gave to your factory, only to be cast aside like I didn't matter. Bianca winced at his words but didn't look away. I know I hurt you, Mr. Caldwell. And I can't take back what I did. But I'm trying to make it right. The details are in the letter, but I want to invite you back. Not for good, not yet, but for a special project. Handmade toys for the children in our community. He studied her, his expression unreadable. Why now? Why should I believe you care, after all this time? Bianca took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. Because I forgot what this factory was supposed to stand for. My grandfather built it on the belief that people matter more than profits. I lost sight of that, and I've seen the damage it's caused. I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can do better. There was a long silence before Mr. Caldwell nodded slowly. I'll think about it, he said gruffly, closing the door. Bianca returned to her car, her hands trembling. She knew this would be an uphill battle, but the encounter left her hopeful. Over the next few days, she visited other artisans, repeating her plea and handing out invitations. Some, like Mr. Caldwell, agreed to consider it. Others refused outright, their anger still too raw. Despite the mixed reactions, a small group of artisans eventually agreed to meet at the factory to discuss the project. On the day of the meeting, Bianca stood in the conference room, her palms damp with nerves. She had arranged for coffee and pastries, hoping to create a welcoming atmosphere. The artisans arrived one by one, their expressions ranging from cautious to skeptical. Among them were familiar faces, people who had once been like family to her. Seeing them again was both comforting and painful. Bianca began the meeting by thanking them for coming, then explained her vision for the project. This isn't just about making toys, she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. It's about bringing back the heart of this factory and giving back to the community. I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm asking for it anyway. The room was silent for a moment before one of the artisans, a middle-aged woman named Clara, spoke up. And what happens after this project? Do we go back to being forgotten? Bianca met her gaze. I don't have all the answers yet. But I promise you this, I'm committed to finding a way to honor the values this factory was built on. This project is just the first step. There was another pause before Clara nodded slowly. I'll give it a try. But don't think for a second that this means I trust you. One by one, the other artisans agreed, some more reluctantly than others. By the end of the meeting, Bianca felt a cautious optimism take root. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a beginning. As the artisans left the factory that day, Bianca stood by the window, watching them walk away. The journal sat on her desk, its pages still open to her grandfather's words, "The magic is in the people." For the first time in years, she felt that magic beginning to return. The factory was still and cold in the early hours of the morning, the winter sun casting long shadows across the polished concrete floors. Bianca stood near the main entrance, her breath forming soft clouds in the crisp air. A group of artisans began to trickle in, their expressions guarded as they crossed the threshold of a place that had once been their second home. Each of them carried with them a mix of emotions, cautious curiosity, lingering resentment, and a faint glimmer of hope. Some walked in pairs, murmuring quietly, while others stayed silent, their eyes scanning the factory's sterile interior. Bianca greeted each one personally, her voice steady but tinged with nervousness. "Thank you for coming," she said, offering a tentative smile. Most nodded in response, their faces unreadable. A few avoided her gaze altogether. As the group gathered in the central workspace, the air grew heavy with unspoken tension. This was the first time many of them had set foot in the factory since their dismissal, and the memories of what had been lost lingered in every corner. Bianca cleared her throat, drawing their attention. "I know this isn't easy," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "And I know that asking you to be here might feel like too little, too late. But I want you to know how much I appreciate your willingness to give this a chance." She gestured toward a table lined with tools and materials, wooden blocks, paintbrushes, carving knives, and jars of paint in vibrant colors. "This is a starting point," she continued. "I've gathered everything we need to begin working on the toys for the community. If there's anything missing, please let me know, and I'll make sure it's taken care of." The artisans exchanged glances, their skepticism evident. Clara, one of the most vocal among them, crossed her arms and stepped forward. "You say this is a starting point," she said, her tone even but pointed. "But a starting point for what? A quick project to save your reputation? Or something real?" Bianca met her gaze, resisting the urge to look away. "It's a starting point for rebuilding trust," she replied. "I know I've let you down, and I know words aren't enough to fix that. This project is about more than just toys. It's about reconnecting with what made this factory special and showing the community that we haven't forgotten who we are." Clara studied her for a moment before nodding, though her expression remained guarded. "We'll see," she said, turning back to the group. The artisans began to move toward the workstations, their movements tentative at first. Bianca watched as they inspected the tools and materials, their hands lingering on the familiar objects. For some, it was like rediscovering an old friend; for others, it was a painful reminder of what had been taken from them. The first few hours were marked by an uneasy quiet. The artisans worked in near silence, the only sounds coming from the scraping of carving knives and the soft clink of brushes against jars of paint. Bianca stayed close by, ready to assist but careful not to intrude. She could feel the weight of their skepticism, but she also noticed small moments of engagement: Clara testing the sharpness of a blade, Mr. Caldwell adjusting the grain of a wooden block with practiced precision. As the day progressed, the atmosphere began to shift. The artisans' movements grew more fluid, their interactions more natural. Clara, who had been one of the most skeptical, began giving pointers to a younger artisan who was struggling with a carving technique. Mr. Caldwell hummed softly under his breath, a tune that Bianca recognized as an old country song her grandfather used to play on the factory radio. The first toy to take shape was a small wooden horse, its lines simple but elegant. Clara held it up for the group to see, her hands steady despite the hint of a smile on her face. "It's not bad," she said, her tone measured. "It's better than not bad," Mr. Caldwell replied, his voice gruff but approving. "It's a start." Bianca watched the exchange from a distance, a flicker of hope sparking within her. She resisted the urge to interject, knowing that this moment wasn't about her. It was about them, rediscovering their craft, reclaiming their space, and finding their rhythm again. As the afternoon wore on, the room grew livelier. The once quiet workspace filled with the sounds of saws, brushes, and the occasional burst of conversation. The artisans began to share stories and jokes, their laughter punctuating the steady hum of activity. Bianca felt a swell of emotion as she listened, reminded of the vibrant energy that had once defined the factory. By the end of the day, several toys had been completed: wooden trains, painted figurines, and a small doll with intricately braided yarn hair. The artisans gathered around the table where the finished toys were displayed, their expressions a mix of pride and nostalgia. Bianca stepped forward, her voice quiet but earnest. "These are beautiful," she said, gesturing to the toys. "Thank you for putting your heart into this. I know it's just the beginning, but it's more than I could have hoped for." Clara glanced at her, her expression softening ever so slightly. "It's a start," she said again, though this time her tone carried a hint of warmth. The group began to disperse, gathering their belongings and preparing to leave. As they walked toward the exit, Bianca caught snippets of their conversations, plans for the next day, ideas for new toy designs, and even a few tentative compliments about the workspace. When the last artisan had gone, Bianca stood alone in the empty factory, the faint smell of sawdust and paint lingering in the air. She looked at the table of finished toys, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and determination. The day hadn't erased the mistakes of the past, nor had it fully healed the wounds she had caused. But it had planted a seed, a small but vital spark of hope. Bianca walked to her office and sat at her desk, pulling out her grandfather's journal. She flipped to a blank page and began to write, her pen moving steadily across the paper. Today, the factory felt alive again. Not in the way it once was, but in a way that felt real and new. The artisans brought their talent, their passion, and their strength. They reminded me of what this place can be when we work together. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I believe in it. She closed the journal and set it aside, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, blanketing the factory grounds in a layer of pristine white. Bianca leaned back in her chair, her thoughts drifting to the days ahead. There was still so much work to be done, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The first sparks of hope had been lit, and she was determined to keep them burning. The sound of tools at work filled the factory, creating a melody of craftsmanship that felt both nostalgic and new. Saws scraped against wood, brushes dipped into jars of vibrant paint, and hammers tapped rhythmically. The artisans were immersed in their craft, their hands moving with the confidence of years spent perfecting their skills. Bianca walked through the rows of workstations, her footsteps muted by the hum of activity. She watched as Mr. Caldwell carved the legs of a wooden horse with steady precision, his fingers deftly guiding the blade along the grain of the wood. Clara was at another table, applying delicate strokes of paint to a doll's face, giving it expressive eyes that seemed to sparkle with life. The transformation of the factory was undeniable. Where there had once been only the cold efficiency of machines, now there was warmth, creativity, and human connection. The sterile silence had been replaced by an energy that seemed to breathe life back into the building itself. The heart of this revival was a sense of purpose that extended beyond the walls of the factory. The artisans weren't just making toys, they were creating gifts meant to bring joy to the children of Nashville. Each piece carried with it a story, a memory, and a piece of the artisan who had crafted it. Bianca approached a group of younger artisans who were working together on a wooden train. They were laughing as they debated the best way to attach the wheels, their camaraderie infectious. One of them, a man named Marcus, looked up and grinned. "Boss," he said, his tone light but respectful, "you ever build one of these yourself?" Bianca smiled, recalling the many hours she'd spent in the factory as a child. "I've painted a few, but I wouldn't trust myself with the carving. My grandfather used to say I was better at making messes than toys." The group chuckled, and Marcus handed her a small block of wood. "Maybe it's time to prove him wrong," he said, winking. She hesitated for a moment before taking the block and sitting down. The artisans around her offered advice and encouragement as she clumsily shaped the wood into the beginnings of a miniature car. Her strokes were uneven, and she nicked her finger more than once, but the process was strangely satisfying. The day wore on, and as more toys took shape, the atmosphere in the factory grew even livelier. Someone brought in a portable speaker and began playing country music, the familiar twang of guitars and cheerful melodies filling the air. Clara, to everyone's surprise, began singing along, her voice strong and clear. Bianca found herself humming along as well, the music stirring memories of Christmases past. She could almost hear her grandfather's voice joining in, his laughter mingling with the sound of the artisans at work. As the afternoon turned into evening, the first completed batch of toys was laid out on a long table in the center of the factory. There were wooden trains painted in bright reds and blues, delicate dolls with intricately sewn clothes, rocking horses polished to a gleaming finish, and a collection of smaller figurines that seemed to come to life under the artisans' skilled hands. The group gathered around the table, admiring their work. Mr. Caldwell picked up a train and turned it over in his hands, his expression softening. "It's been a long time since I've seen toys like this," he said quietly. "Toys that feel like they mean something." Clara nodded, her gaze lingering on the doll she'd painted. "It's not just the toys," she said. "It's the feeling of being part of something. Of creating something real." Bianca stood at the edge of the group, her chest tightening with emotion. She hadn't expected the project to have this kind of impact, not just on the community but on the artisans themselves. They were reclaiming their craft, their pride, and their sense of belonging. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Ellen, who stepped into the room carrying a clipboard. She looked around, her expression a mixture of surprise and approval. "This is incredible," Ellen said, her voice genuine. "I didn't expect it to come together like this." Bianca smiled, gesturing toward the table. "Neither did I. But it's more than I could have hoped for." Ellen glanced at her clipboard, then back at the toys. "We've already had interest from a few local organizations who want to help distribute these to the kids. And the press is starting to take notice. There's a lot of buzz about what you're doing here." The mention of the press made Bianca's stomach tighten. She had avoided giving interviews or making public statements, wanting the focus to remain on the project rather than on herself. But she also knew that the factory's story was changing, and the world was beginning to notice. "I'll talk to them," Bianca said after a moment. "But only if it helps highlight the artisans and the community. This isn't about me." Ellen nodded, her expression approving. "I'll make sure they know that." As the day came to a close, the artisans began packing up their tools and cleaning their workstations. The energy in the room remained high, fueled by a shared sense of accomplishment. Bianca stayed behind, watching as they filed out, their laughter and chatter echoing down the hallway. When the factory was finally empty, she walked over to the table of toys and ran her fingers lightly over their surfaces. Each one was a testament to the talent and dedication of the people who had crafted them. They were more than just toys, they were symbols of resilience, creativity, and the power of community. Bianca picked up the small car she had attempted to carve earlier. It was rough and uneven, its edges far from perfect, but it held a special significance for her. She placed it back on the table, next to the more polished creations of the artisans, and smiled. The factory lights cast a warm glow over the room, illuminating the toys and the workstations that had once stood empty. Bianca felt a renewed sense of purpose as she looked around, her grandfather's words echoing in her mind, "The magic is in the people." For the first time in years, she felt like she was honoring that legacy. The factory wasn't just a business, it was a place where dreams were built, memories were made, and traditions were kept alive. As she turned off the lights and headed for the door, Bianca allowed herself to hope that this was just the beginning. The magic was back, and she was determined to keep it alive. The factory was alive with a vibrant energy, each corner buzzing with activity. Artisans worked with focus and determination, their tools moving deftly as the final batch of toys began to take shape. The deadline loomed large, only days away, and everyone felt the weight of the challenge. Yet, despite the pressure, there was a growing sense of camaraderie in the air. Bianca walked through the factory floor, stopping occasionally to check on the progress of a project or offer a word of encouragement. She could see the artisans were more at ease now, their movements fluid and confident. The sound of hammers and saws was punctuated by bursts of laughter and snippets of conversation. She paused near Clara's workstation, where a row of dolls sat in various stages of completion. Clara was sewing tiny dresses for them, her hands moving with practiced ease. Bianca picked up one of the finished dolls, admiring the intricate detail in its embroidered face and carefully braided yarn hair. "These are beautiful," Bianca said sincerely. Clara glanced up, her expression softening just slightly. "They're coming together," she admitted. "Still a lot to finish, though." "We'll get there," Bianca said, her voice steady. "We always do." Clara gave a small nod before returning to her work. Despite the progress, the enormity of the task weighed heavily on Bianca. The goal was ambitious, to produce enough toys for every child in the community who might not otherwise receive a gift this Christmas. The thought of falling short gnawed at her, but she pushed the doubt aside. There was no room for failure, not now. As the day wore on, a storm began to brew outside. Heavy clouds gathered in the sky, casting a gray pall over the town. By late afternoon, snow began to fall in thick, wet flakes, quickly blanketing the streets and buildings. Ellen appeared in the doorway, her expression anxious. "We've got a problem," she said, pulling Bianca aside. "The storm's worse than expected. Some of the volunteers we arranged for delivery are calling to cancel, they can't make it through the snow." Bianca's stomach sank. The toys were nearly ready, but without a way to deliver them, the entire project could be derailed. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad," Ellen said. "Roads are already closing in some areas. If this keeps up, we're going to need a backup plan." Bianca nodded, her mind racing. "Let me think. We can't give up now." Ellen left to take more calls, and Bianca turned to face the factory floor. The artisans were still hard at work, oblivious to the logistical nightmare unfolding outside. She couldn't bring herself to tell them, not yet. For now, she needed to focus on finding a solution. The answer came unexpectedly, in the form of a knock at the factory door. Bianca opened it to find Marcus, one of the younger artisans, standing with a group of locals. They were bundled in coats and scarves, their faces flushed from the cold. "We heard about the storm," Marcus said, his breath visible in the frosty air. "Figured you might need some extra hands." Bianca blinked, surprised. "You came out in this weather?" He shrugged. "Wouldn't feel right sitting at home when there's work to be done. Besides," he added with a grin, "we're not going to let a little snow ruin Christmas." The group filed into the factory, shaking off the cold and shedding their layers. Some were neighbors, others were members of the community who had been following the project. They brought with them a renewed energy and a sense of determination that lifted the mood in the room. Bianca quickly organized them into teams, assigning tasks and explaining what needed to be done. Some helped finish the toys, while others began packing them into boxes. A few even volunteered to brave the storm and handle deliveries themselves, using four-wheel drive vehicles to navigate the treacherous roads. The storm raged on, but inside the factory, it was warm and bright. Someone had brought a thermos of hot cocoa, which was passed around as people worked. The music played louder, the chatter grew livelier, and the sense of shared purpose deepened. Bianca couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as she watched the scene unfold. This wasn't just about the toys anymore, it was about the community coming together, united by a common goal. The barriers that had once divided them seemed to melt away, replaced by a spirit of collaboration and goodwill. By midnight, the first wave of deliveries was ready to go. Marcus and a few others loaded the boxes into their vehicles, their breath visible in the icy air. Bianca stood by the door, handing out the last of the delivery lists and thanking each volunteer personally. "Be careful out there," she said as Marcus climbed into the driver's seat of his truck. That he gave her a thumbs up. "Don't worry, boss. We've got this." The trucks rumbled off into the snow, their taillights disappearing into the whiteout. Bianca stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them go before heading back inside. The artisans were still working, determined to finish the remaining toys by morning. Clara and Mr. Caldwell were leading the charge, their years of experience guiding the younger artisans through the final steps. Bianca joined them, picking up a paintbrush and losing herself in the rhythm of the work. As the hours passed, exhaustion began to creep in, but no one stopped. The storm outside howled against the factory walls, but the warmth inside seemed to push it back. Finally, as dawn broke, the last toy was placed on the table. The artisans erupted into cheers and applause, their faces lit with a mixture of relief and triumph. Bianca looked around the room, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We did it." Clara stepped forward, a rare smile on her face. "Don't let it go to your head, McLean," she said, though her tone was teasing. "But yeah, we did." The remaining toys were quickly packed up and sent out with the final group of volunteers. As the factory emptied, Bianca stood by the table of tools and materials, reflecting on what they had accomplished. That it wasn't just about the toys, she realized. It was about the bonds they had rebuilt, the trust they had begun to restore, and the magic they had rediscovered. The storm had tested them, but they had risen to the challenge. And in doing so, they had proven that even in the face of adversity, the spirit of Christmas, and the strength of a united community, could shine through. The night of the Christmas celebration arrived, and the McLean factory was transformed into a place of wonder. Twinkling lights draped across the rafters cast a warm glow, illuminating the rows of workstations now cleared to make space for long tables filled with food and decorations. The smell of fresh pine mingled with the faint scent of sawdust, creating an atmosphere that felt both festive and familiar. Bianca stood near the entrance, taking in the sight of families arriving in droves. Children, bundled in scarves and mittens, pointed excitedly at the decorations, their faces lit with wide smiles. Parents followed close behind, their expressions a mix of curiosity and gratitude. For many, this was their first time stepping inside the factory, a place they had heard so much about but never visited. Volunteers guided the families to their seats, while others distributed cups of hot cocoa and plates piled high with cookies and pastries. The sounds of laughter and cheerful conversation filled the air, blending seamlessly with the soft strains of holiday music playing in the background. Bianca couldn't help but smile as she watched the scene unfold. The factory, once a source of tension and division, now buzzed with joy and togetherness. The rows of toys were displayed prominently at the far end of the room, their vibrant colors and intricate designs drawing the attention of every child who passed by. Clara approached her, a clipboard in hand and a rare look of contentment on her face. "We've got everyone seated," she said. "And the volunteers are ready to start handing out the toys." Bianca nodded. "Perfect. Thank you, Clara. For everything." Clara gave her a small smile, a gesture that spoke volumes. "It's been a team effort," she said before heading back into the crowd. As the families settled in, Bianca stepped onto a small stage set up at the front of the room. She tapped the microphone, the soft feedback drawing the attention of the crowd. The chatter quieted, and all eyes turned toward her. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Thank you all for being here tonight. This celebration is about more than just toys, it's about community. It's about coming together, supporting one another, and remembering the traditions that make this time of year so special." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. For many years, McLean's Toys was a place where dreams were built. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. But thanks to the incredible artisans who gave their time and talent to this project, we've been able to rediscover the magic that makes this factory, and this community, so extraordinary. There was a ripple of applause, and Bianca felt a swell of gratitude. Tonight, these toys are our gift to the children of Nashville. They were made with care, with love, and with the hope that they will bring joy to every child who receives them. So please, enjoy the evening, and thank you for reminding us all what it means to truly come together. The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the factory. Bianca stepped down from the stage, her heart racing but full. Volunteers began distributing the toys, and the children's excitement was palpable. One by one, they approached the tables, their eyes wide with anticipation. Each child received a toy chosen just for them, a wooden train, a hand-painted doll, a rocking horse, or a set of carved figurines. The room filled with delighted squeals and laughter as they unwrapped their gifts and showed them off to their families. At one table, a little boy clutched a wooden airplane, his eyes shining as he ran his fingers over its polished surface. "Mom, look," he exclaimed. "It's just like the one Grandpa used to have." Nearby, a young girl held a doll with bright yarn hair and a dress sewn from soft fabric. She hugged it tightly, a smile spreading across her face as she whispered, "She's perfect." Bianca moved quietly through the crowd, taking it all in. She stopped to chat with families, shaking hands and exchanging warm greetings. The gratitude in their voices was overwhelming, but what struck her most was the joy, the pure, unfiltered happiness that radiated from every corner of the room. As the evening wore on, the celebration grew even more festive. A group of local musicians took to the stage, their instruments filling the factory with the cheerful sounds of country Christmas tunes. Couples danced near the tables, their movements light and carefree. Children ran and played, their laughter ringing out like the sweetest of carols. Bianca found herself standing near Mr. Caldwell, who was leaning against a workbench, watching the scene with a satisfied expression. "This," he said, gesturing to the room, "this is what it's all about. People coming together, sharing something real. Your grandfather would be proud." Bianca turned to him, her eyes shining. I couldn't have done this without all of you. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. For believing in this, even when I wasn't sure I could make it work. He gave a small chuckle. You had a lot to prove, that's for sure. But you've done right by us. And by this town. The two stood in comfortable silence, watching as the celebration unfolded. As the night drew to a close, Bianca stepped back onto the stage for one final announcement. The room quieted once more, the families turning their attention to her. Before we end the evening, I have one more thing to share, she said. This project was just the beginning. Starting in the new year, McLean's Toys will launch a new initiative that combines technology with traditional craftsmanship. We'll be bringing back the handmade touch that made us who we are while embracing innovation to move us forward. And more importantly, we'll be creating jobs that honor the talents of our artisans and the values of our community. The applause that followed was thunderous, a standing ovation that left Bianca momentarily speechless. She smiled, her heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment and hope. As the families began to leave, many stopped to thank her personally. Children hugged their new toys close, their parents expressing heartfelt gratitude. Bianca accepted their words humbly, knowing that this night wasn't about her, it was about all of them. When the factory finally emptied, Bianca lingered in the quiet space, the echoes of the evening still lingering in the air. The tables were cleared, the lights dimmed, but the magic of the night remained. She walked to the table where the artisans had worked, running her hand over its surface. It had been a long journey to get here, filled with mistakes, lessons, and moments of doubt. But tonight had proven that it was all worth it. As she left the factory, the snow outside sparkled under the light of the moon. Bianca paused to take in the scene, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. This was more than a celebration, it was a new beginning. A chance to honor the past, embrace the future, and carry the spirit of Christmas forward, not just for one night, but for years to come. The days following the Christmas celebration were marked by a hum of quiet satisfaction that seemed to settle over the factory and the community alike. The echoes of the joyous evening lingered in every conversation, every shared smile, every word of thanks from parents whose children had woken up on Christmas morning to find handcrafted toys waiting for them. Bianca sat at her desk in the factory's office, gazing out of the window. Snow still blanketed the grounds, glistening under the pale winter sunlight. In front of her lay her grandfather's journal, its well-worn pages open to a passage she had read countless times since the project began. The magic is in the people. Build for them, with them, and you'll never fail. For the first time in years, those words felt like a guiding light rather than a distant memory. The knock on her office door was soft but insistent. Ellen stepped inside, a folder tucked under her arm and a familiar mixture of urgency and purpose in her expression. You've got a full day ahead, Ellen said, setting the folder on the desk. First up is the meeting with the artisans, and then we'll finalize the plans for the new initiative. Bianca nodded, closing the journal and setting it aside. How are the artisans feeling about everything? I know this transition is going to be delicate. Ellen tilted her head thoughtfully. Cautiously optimistic. They've seen what you're trying to do, but there's still some skepticism. It's going to take time for everyone to fully trust the changes. Bianca took a deep breath. That's fair. I just hope they can see how serious I am about this. I don't want this to be a temporary fix. It has to be something real, something sustainable. They'll see, Ellen said with a small smile. Just keep doing what you're doing. The meeting with the artisans was held in the same room where they had gathered weeks ago to discuss the Christmas project. The atmosphere, however, was noticeably different. The tension that had once hung in the air like a storm cloud was now replaced by a cautious sense of hope. Bianca stood at the front of the room, addressing the group with a mixture of confidence and humility. First, I want to thank all of you again for the incredible work you did on the Christmas project, she began. The toys you created weren't just gifts, they were symbols of what this factory and this community are capable of when we work together. There were murmurs of agreement, a few nods from the crowd. But this can't just be about one project, Bianca continued. We need to build something that lasts. Something that combines the innovation we've embraced with the traditions that define us. That's why, starting in the new year, McLean's Toys will be implementing a new production model, one that brings back handmade craftsmanship alongside the efficiency of modern technology. She paused, letting the words sink in. This isn't just about making toys. It's about creating jobs that honor your skills and your contributions. It's about building a future where this factory isn't just a workplace but a part of this community, a place that values people over profit. The room was quiet for a moment, and Bianca could feel the weight of their scrutiny. Then, Mr. Caldwell spoke up, his voice steady and measured. "You've got a lot to prove, Bianca," he said. "But I'll admit, you've come a long way. If you're serious about this, you've got my support." Clara nodded in agreement, her arms crossed but her expression softening. "We'll hold you to it, McLean. But I think you're on the right track." The murmurs of agreement grew louder, and Bianca felt a surge of relief and determination. This was only the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. The rest of the meeting was spent discussing the logistics of the new model. Bianca outlined plans for hiring additional artisans, creating dedicated spaces for handcrafted production within the factory, and marketing the new line of toys as a blend of tradition and innovation. The artisans offered suggestions and raised concerns, and Bianca listened carefully, taking notes and promising to address their feedback. By the time the meeting ended, there was a palpable sense of progress in the room. The artisans lingered to chat with one another, their conversations filled with cautious optimism about the future. As the group began to disperse, Clara approached Bianca, her expression unreadable. "You've got a lot of work ahead of you," she said. "But I'll admit, I'm starting to believe you're serious about this." Bianca smiled, her gratitude evident. "Thank you, Clara. That means a lot." "Just don't screw it up," Clara added, her tone teasing but with an edge of seriousness. "I'll do my best," Bianca replied, her smile widening. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity. Bianca and Ellen worked through the logistics of the new initiative, coordinating with suppliers, drafting contracts, and planning outreach to potential partners. They also began preparing for a public announcement to share the news with the community. That evening, as the factory quieted down, Bianca found herself once again reflecting on how far they had come. The journey had been anything but smooth, but the progress they had made felt real and meaningful. She walked through the factory floor, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty space. The workstations were tidy, the tools neatly arranged, and the faint scent of sawdust lingered in the air. Bianca paused near the table where the Christmas toys had been displayed, her mind replaying the joy and gratitude she had witnessed during the celebration. This factory, she realized, was more than just a building. It was a place where dreams were crafted, where traditions were preserved, and where the community's spirit came to life. And now, it was on the verge of a new chapter, one that honored its past while embracing its future. Bianca returned to her office and opened her grandfather's journal. Picking up her pen, she began to write, her thoughts flowing freely onto the page. "Today, we took another step forward. The artisans are cautious, but I can see the hope in their eyes. They want this to work as much as I do, and that gives me strength. This isn't just about restoring the factory, it's about rebuilding trust, reclaiming our identity, and creating something that will endure. We have a long road ahead, but for the first time, I feel like we're on the right path." She closed the journal, a sense of quiet resolve settling over her. The promise she had made to the community, and to herself, was clear. This was only the beginning, but she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the town in a pristine white, Bianca felt a spark of determination light within her. The year ahead would be one of rebuilding, innovation, and growth. And with the support of the artisans and the community, she was ready to lead McLean's Toys into a future that honored its past while embracing the possibilities to come. The first rays of sunlight broke over the snow-covered streets of Nashville, casting a golden glow on the town as it stirred to life. At the McLean factory, the scene was a mix of anticipation and calm. The holiday season had passed, and the new year had begun, bringing with it the promise of a fresh start. inside the factory, the air was filled with a quiet hum of activity. The artisans worked steadily, their hands shaping wood, sewing fabric, and painting delicate details onto toys. Each workstation was a testament to their craft, blending the traditional techniques that had defined McLean's toys for decades with the modern tools and equipment that promised to carry the factory into the future. Bianca stood in the center of the room, observing the flow of work. She felt a deep sense of pride watching the artisans, many of whom she had feared would never return. The doubt and resentment that had once defined their interactions were slowly being replaced by trust and mutual respect. It was a fragile balance, but one that grew stronger with each passing day. She had spent the weeks following the Christmas celebration working tirelessly to implement the factory's new model. The production line had been restructured to include dedicated spaces for handcrafted toys, while the automated machines were adjusted to handle simpler tasks that complemented the artisan's work rather than replacing it. The result was a process that felt uniquely McLean, one that honored tradition while embracing progress. Today was the culmination of those efforts. Bianca had invited the community to the factory for an open house, an opportunity to see firsthand the changes that had been made and to celebrate the start of this new chapter. By mid-morning, the factory was buzzing with visitors. Families, neighbors, and local business owners filled the space, their curiosity evident as they explored the workstations and displays. The artisans greeted them warmly, demonstrating their techniques and sharing stories about their craft. Clara was stationed at a painting table, where children gathered to watch her work. She showed them how to mix colors and apply delicate strokes, her usual stern demeanor softened by their eager questions. "Can I try?" a little girl asked, her wide eyes fixed on the brush in Clara's hand. Clara hesitated for a moment before handing the brush over. "Be gentle," she said, her voice kind but firm. "It's all about steady hands." The girl's face lit up as she carefully added a dab of paint to a wooden doll. Clara watched her with a small smile, offering guidance when needed but letting her take the lead. Nearby, Mr. Caldwell was demonstrating carving techniques to a group of adults. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, transforming a block of wood into the beginnings of a rocking horse. The crowd watched in awe, their appreciation evident in their murmured admiration. "This," Mr. Caldwell said, holding up the unfinished piece, "is what makes every toy unique. Machines can't do this. It's not just about the skill, it's about the heart you put into it." Bianca moved through the crowd, stopping to greet familiar faces and answer questions. She could feel the energy in the room, a mix of excitement and nostalgia. Many of the visitors commented on how the factory felt different, warmer, more alive, than it had in years. At one point, she spotted Grace standing near the back of the room. It had been months since they'd last spoken, and their friendship still bore the scars of past decisions. Bianca hesitated for a moment before approaching her. "Grace," she said softly, her voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. Grace turned, her expression guarded but not unkind. "Bianca," she replied. "I'm glad you came," Bianca said. "It means a lot to me." Grace nodded, her gaze sweeping over the factory floor. "It's different," she said. "In a good way. It feels like the McLean's toys I remember." Bianca smiled, a mixture of relief and gratitude washing over her. "That's what I've been working toward. I want this place to be more than just a factory again. I want it to be a part of the community." Grace studied her for a moment before offering a small smile. "You're getting there," she said. "But don't stop now. This is just the beginning." "I won't," Bianca promised. The afternoon brought a series of speeches and presentations. Bianca stood on the stage, addressing the crowd with the same mixture of nerves and determination she had felt on Christmas Eve. "Thank you all for being here today," she began. "This factory has been a part of Nashville for generations. It's more than just a business, it's a piece of our history, a place where creativity and community come together. Over the past few months, I've had the privilege of rediscovering what makes McLean's toys so special, and it's all of you. The artisans, the families, the people who believe in what we're creating here." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room. "Today marks the start of a new chapter for McLean's toys. We're combining the traditions that built this factory with the innovation that will carry us forward. And we're doing it together, as a community." The crowd erupted into applause, their support resounding in the spacious room. After the speeches, Bianca mingled with the guests, answering questions about the new production model and listening to their feedback. The excitement was contagious, and by the time the event began to wind down, Bianca felt a renewed sense of purpose. As the visitors began to leave, many stopped to thank her personally. Children waved goodbye, clutching the small toys they had painted or carved during the open house. Parents expressed their appreciation for the factory's renewed commitment to the community. When the last guest had departed, Bianca stood in the now quiet factory, taking a moment to reflect. The day had been a success, but she knew there was still work to be done. The trust she had begun to rebuild would need to be nurtured, and the changes she had implemented would require constant care and attention. Clara and Mr. Caldwell approached her, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "Not bad for a day's work," Clara said, her tone light but approving. "Not bad at all," Mr. Caldwell agreed. Bianca smiled, her gratitude evident. "Thank you both for everything. You've earned it," Clara said. "Just don't let us down." "I won't," Bianca promised. As they left, Bianca lingered for a moment longer, the quiet of the factory wrapping around her like a warm embrace. She walked to her office, where her grandfather's journal sat on the desk. Opening it to a fresh page, she picked up her pen and began to write. "Today was the first step in what I hope will be a long and meaningful journey. The factory feels alive again, filled with the spirit of those who believe in its potential. I can see the path ahead, and while it won't always be easy, I know we're moving in the right direction. Together, we're building something that will last, not just toys, but a legacy of connection, creativity, and community." She closed the journal, her resolve stronger than ever. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the snow-covered town. It was a new beginning, not just for the factory, but for everyone it touched. Bianca stood at the window, watching as the lights of Nashville began to twinkle in the fading light. The journey ahead was full of possibilities, and she was ready to face them with open hands and an open heart. The magic of McLean's toys had been reborn, and with it, the promise of a brighter future for all. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your favorite part in the comments below. Your support means so much to us. See you in the next video.